It's a war zone. Every day is a war zone.
Fatal drug overdoses are on the rise in Washington, and the deadline for the state to deal with a temporary fix to our drug possession laws is approaching fast.
It doesn't work. It hasn't worked.
Law enforcement agencies say their hands have been tied for 2 years, and there's growing demand for more accountability.
We need the proper leverage to get these folks into treatment.
Substance use disorder is a public health issue.
Can Olympia strike the right balance this session?
Almost everyone agrees that the war on drugs was a failure.
We hear from the experts.
The system needs to be there to make this work.
Laying down the law on illegal drug possession while treating the trauma of addiction. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callahan. With the Blake decision in February of 2021, our state Supreme Court determined Washington's drug possession felony law was unconstitutional. State lawmakers responded with a temporary measure that April, which requires police to offer drug treatment options to people twice before a misdemeanor arrest can be made. But that temporary law, which has had mixed results, is set to expire on July 1st this year, creating a high-stakes showdown at the state capitol. What's the right balance between providing treatment and justice? A policy decision on drug possession is coming in a matter of months that will impact our state for decades to come.
My life was a mess.
These are the stories of survivors.
I ended up addicted to methamphetamine.
Those who have come back from the ledge of drug addiction.
I turned to what I knew, drugs and sex.
They are stories all too familiar to Josh Wallace. Because he has a story too, dating back to when he was growing up in the Seattle area.
At that point in my life, I really just didn't want to exist.
Wallace says he was raped as a young man and started taking ecstasy and methamphetamine as a way to deal with his trauma. He was homeless for 6 years and arrested for felony drug possession in 2005.
Every day is a war zone, and the police are not your friends, and the courts are not your friends.
But Wallace did find a friend in the form of a peer who shared his addiction experience. From the nonprofit now known as Peer Washington, he convinced Wallace to go to drug court, where he took on his mental health challenges too.
So drug court, in combination with this organization, is what saved my life.
So what I'm going to have you do right now is our little intake on our iPad.
Peer Washington now helps nearly 2,500 people across the state each year, led by Josh Wallace, who is now its president and CEO.
These are intramuscular naloxone kits?
He points to King County records that show a 75% reduction in jail bookings for participants in Peer Washington's services. But the future of these types of services is a bit unclear.
I needed help.
Wallace is advocating in Olympia this session with a major deadline fast approaching. The state Supreme Court's Blake decision of 2021 found that Washington's drug possession felony statute was unconstitutional. State lawmakers responded soon after by making drug possession a misdemeanor that requires police officers to offer treatment to suspects twice before making an arrest.
Our experiment with effective legalization of drugs has failed.
But that legal framework, which many law enforcement officers say has kept them from doing their jobs and has not helped place more people in treatment, was a temporary fix that expires in July of this year.
We need tools to get individuals into treatment and keep our communities and our kids safe.
As Olympia crafts a permanent path forward this spring, Wallace wants lawmakers to focus on treatment, not criminal punishment, as a way to protect the health of his clients and the entire state.
This is going to make the difference for many, many years to come as to whether or not we are lifting people up and out of addiction, or whether we're going to double down on this war on drugs and continue to put so much money into harming people.
A lot of people say to me, why did you legalize drugs? We didn't legalize drugs, but that's the perception that's out there, and after a while, perception becomes reality.
State Senator June Robinson, the Democrat from the 38th District in Everett, says the stopgap measure the legislature passed 2 years ago during a nationwide racial reckoning was an attempt to truly end the war on drugs. But she admits it hasn't been effective.
It doesn't work. It hasn't worked.
We need the proper leverage to get these folks into treatment.
Substance use disorder is a public health issue.
And while state leaders have debated whether to make drug possession a felony again or decriminalize it altogether, it appears Olympia will land on the option Robinson is sponsoring, Senate Bill 5536.
We need a balance between compassion and accountability.
5536 would make drug possession a gross misdemeanor, but officers would be required to offer pre-booking drug treatment options. In some cases, those who do end up getting charged could complete treatment and get those charges dropped.
It definitely puts a criminal penalty in there, but also recognizes that substance use disorder is a disease that needs treatment, and we're trying to offer those opportunities.
Robinson's measure has received bipartisan support and, importantly, the support of several law enforcement agencies.
The path to eventual recovery should likely lead to dismissal of the charge.
Josh Wallace says he understands a gross misdemeanor may be the likely political compromise. But he's worried the legal pendulum may be swinging back towards criminalizing drug addiction.
I see all of the old systems wanting to double down on all the same old broken processes.
Amidst a nationwide crisis where drug overdose deaths have quintupled in the past 20 years, Olympia has a serious decision ahead as the deadline looms to fix our state's drug possession law before July 1st.
I'm very hopeful that we can find a good solution.
Let's make this bill right so that we can move forward in a way that's going to be beneficial for all Washingtonians.
And joining us to give us some more background on this very complex issue, I have in the studio with me Steve Strand. He is the Executive Director of the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. Steve, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
And also we have with us over Zoom Lisa Daugaard. She is Co-Executive Director of the Public Defender Association. Lisa, good to see you too.
Great to be here.
All right, let's jump right into it. Before we get into some of the changes that Olympia is considering here, I want to start with where we are now, the present-day landscape of law enforcement and drug possession. So the Blake decision happened 2 years ago. The legislature did this temporary fix by making drug possession a misdemeanor, but officers are required to offer treatment twice before making an arrest. Steve, just from the point of view of law enforcement, has that worked?
Short answer, no, it hasn't. We understand the legislature's intent. A lot of these conversations were happening already about how to approach this issue differently. But the sort of forced, rapid decision that the legislature made with, I think, good intentions, really has been problematic. And what we're seeing is feedback from jurisdictions where they're making, over the last 2 years, hundreds of contacts with persons with addiction issues. And I think I had one jurisdiction that said that they've had one person take them up on treatment. So if the goal is to get people into treatment first and foremost, this current system is certainly not working, and you're certainly seeing the increases in overdose deaths.
Yeah.
That's real data and real human lives that I think show it isn't working in terms of what we're doing right now.
Thanks a lot for that, Steve. Lisa, I want to get your take on the current situation for drug possession in our state. I've heard some critics say the past 2 years have been a failed experiment in legalizing drugs. How do you look at what's been going on?
Well, we have a short memory. We have decades of failed drug policy, and actually I think there was wide agreement before the Blake decision that we needed to make a paradigm shift in the way that we approach these problems. To be clear, we have a drug use crisis. We have a crisis of despair. This is national. It is not limited to Washington State. It is not caused by the change in the legal framework that we saw after the Blake decision. But I agree with Steve. Back in 2020, early 2021, we were deep in a consensus building process about what kind of policy framework Washington State should choose to move past the war on drugs. Going back a couple of years, almost everyone agrees that the war on drugs was a failure. It isn't that the failing started in 2021 after the Blake decision.
Yeah.
As a society, we've been on the wrong course for a long, long time. And most people agree, most law enforcement officers agree, most prosecutors. The question is, what are we going to put in its place? And the thing is, you can't turn the ocean liner around on a dime. Unfortunately, in 2021, the legislature had, a matter of weeks to put something in place that just wasn't, we did not have the process that the complexity of these issues requires.
Thank you for that. And Lisa, I want to make sure we move on to this next piece. We're focusing on Senate Bill 5536 with this show, which would make drug possession a gross misdemeanor, but officers would be required to offer some pre-booking options for drug treatment services. So this middle ground, not decriminalizing drug possession, but not making it a felony again, appears to be where the momentum in Olympia is going right now. Do you think this strikes the right balance between the need for justice and the need for services to treat drug addiction?
Well, my organization and I have long believed that pushing people into the criminal legal system is almost never helpful in stabilization or recovery. That said, fully understand why you can't just overnight remove the approach that we've had when we don't have an alternative paradigm to put in its place without honestly creating a lot of false nostalgia for the way things used to be. The fact is that the most urgent thing we need to do is to create community-based care that everyone can refer people to, connect people to, that works, including police officers. Police officers do encounter people in need, and they do need a path that's accessible to them, effective, credible, and we don't have that. And so they're right in saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, and I need a path.
Right, right. I guess, Stephen, looking about this, what do you think about 5536? You brought up some accountability issues earlier with this whole system. Does this solve some of those problems? What do you think?
Everything we're talking about is that intersection of the criminal justice system and issues related to addiction and behavioral health, which usually are co-occurring. And look at all the issues that they create for public safety, for obviously human lives, and things that we're seeing right now in our society, just in terms of issues that are of concern to people. And the points that Lisa make are excellent. It is an ocean liner.
Yeah.
And these conversations did precede the Blake decision. That's absolutely correct. And I think law enforcement is among the first to say, how do we do this better?
Yeah.
And one of the ways I view this, and the bill that you're asking about, and these complex decisions the legislature now has to make, is how do we've always sort of, I guess, viewed this societally going back decades as punishment first, then treatment, maybe, if it's available, and all the issues related to the availability of treatment. This switches those two around. And instead of saying, well, no punishment and no incentive to stop using and to do something else, it's still there, but it's really as the backup to treatment, and it puts treatment first.
Okay.
And my opinion is that, one of the reasons I'm here and one of the reasons that we're supportive of these bills is we understand exactly what Lisa's talking about in terms of putting treatment and access to treatment first, with punishment when needed and when necessary, but that's not the first preference.
Thank you. And Lisa, maybe you can break this down for us. What would things actually look like if 5536 gets passed? Let's say a person gets stopped for drug possession. What happens when that person accepts treatment and completes it? And then what also happens if that person does not accept treatment or does not complete it? Can you take us down those two paths, please?
Sure. Well, I think, it's far from clear that the current form of this bill is where the legislature is going to end up. As written, it does continue, it does not mandate, but it continues to encourage police officers to make diversion to community-based care a first strategy. So and that's, for me, the most important feature, and something the bill really gets right. It does not require that anybody go into the court system, and if police officers have a diversion channel available, they are encouraged to use it. I do want to comment on this concept of treatment. The fact is that how people recover, it's very American to want a simple transaction that, and in a way that's the button that arrest pushes. Oh, we did something. But treatment is a long recovery, I should say. It's a long process. Increasingly, our field completely acknowledges that recovery is based on relationship. It isn't some transactional 14-day, 30-day, 6-month event. Rather, it is based on people regaining hope for their lives to have meaning, for them to be safe and secure, a realistic path for that to happen, and gaining strength to make hard choices that require overcoming the impulse for self-sabotage and all of the things that trauma causes and challenges that most of us face when we're trying to break habits that we use to cope with life's traumas.
Okay.
So we have to understand that the course of recovery is not something that you fail or succeed at.
Mm-hmm.
Almost nobody who ever addresses substance use issues does so in a way that is, one and done. And we need to be very careful, not when people are have embarked on that process, that we're continuing to support and reinforce, and don't blow up their progress by breaking them on purpose, which is usually what criminal punishment does.
Yeah.
That, all of what I just said, is something that law enforcement in this state has repeatedly proven that they can embrace. So law enforcement can be partners in a paradigm that is based in community care, and where law enforcement is just exchanging information and continuously reinforcing people's path to recovery. Legislation can make that possible, but we need investments in community-based care strategies to make it happen.
Yep.
And legislation can make it impossible, and that's what I really hope to see in this session, is just that we don't have legislative impediments to the kind of work that we already have in. There's an arrest and jail alternatives program that Steve's organization hosts that's really effective. LEAD is popular and effective. We just need to grow those.
And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Steve, you had your hand up for a second. What did you
I was just going to say, I appreciate Lisa's comment about how law enforcement has embraced a lot of this. I think that's really true. And again, I think it's important to underline, this is not a binary choice. This is not, let's go back to the war on drugs or let's legalize all drugs. This is about that complex system that will allow law enforcement to be one of the stakeholders to provide the support to do everything that Lisa just talked about.
Yeah.
And both Senator Robinson's bill and Senator Solomon's bill, both of which are, I think, really good bills and have some good content, and kudos to both senators for their work on this, is it reflects what Lisa just talked about, which is this is not a magic washing machine. This is human beings with complex issues that go back a long time, and that and I think law enforcement recognizes the criminal justice system, and putting somebody into a system that can create long-term records, long-term issues that sometimes make these problems worse.
Yeah.
How do we make this all work together while still holding that sanction, which I think is absolutely necessary for those who simply say, I have no interest and I'm going to continue to do what I'm doing? That's really where we are.
And I wanted to talk about that because I think within this bill, there's the provision that says, okay, let's say you are charged. In situations where that person is able to complete treatment, those charges can be vacated. They can be nullified, and that's super important. But I wanted to take it that one step further with you, Steve, because I know some Senate Republicans out there are saying this gross misdemeanor is not enough. It won't compel people to actually take treatment. Is this going to turn the tables so that jurisdiction where only one person is taking up treatment, are more people going to take up treatment with this kind of system?
Yeah, that's a critical question to everything we're talking about. Is use the word compel, incentivize is another way to look at it. But it's for that sanction is really reserved in the system we're talking about right now, or the proposals, as for those who simply say, no, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not interested in treatment. It doesn't require them to do this all in a week. It recognizes the challenges of addiction, but it also respects victims of crime and those affected by some of these things related to these problems. And I think it's a good balance. Getting back to your question, the felony is the way it used to be.
Right.
Gross misdemeanor, I think, is a reasonable compromise because it is still a significant sanction. And one of the issues, it's a little inside baseball, but what we've seen sometimes is that if the sanction is not severe enough with a misdemeanor, that an attorney sometimes in working with their client will say, hey, take the 3 days or take the 4 days in jail rather than going through treatment. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what we're looking for.
I see.
And when I say we, I mean society, not law enforcement. And so the sanction has to be significant without it becoming another criminalization and punitive element. And that's the balance we have to strike.
Thank you for that. And Lisa, I wanted to go back to you and talk about this availability of treatment piece, because I think it's a key part of some of these solutions that are thought about with 5536. There have to be facilities for people to go to, get the services they need to deal with drug addiction. There need to be enough service providers too. Do we have enough services now? Is the state investing enough in this side of the equation? What can you tell us?
I can say that we don't. One of the important developments over the last year was the Substance Use and Recovery Services Advisory Committee, the SURSAC, made recommendations about innovations in care that are really important to implement no matter what the formal legal framework is that is chosen. I will say one of those that I think is, we know advances the ball is investment in case management and in the pre-booking diversion context, like LEAD, like the arrest and jail alternatives that Steve's organization administers.
Diversion programs.
Those are not, those are very popular. They work well where they exist around the state, and they're not scaled anywhere. So most people who would benefit from them don't have access to them, and we can change that. We know what to do. We're just not doing it anywhere near scale. I do want to say that so housing is part of treatment. Access to good mental health care is part of treatment. This isn't all about biochemical reactions. This is about people trying to survive under really miserable circumstances. But I think when I say that memory is short, drug possession has been a felony in Washington state for decades, until 2021. And it never worked to compel people into recovery. And it did a lot of harm. We have to try making recovery services available to people, and before we conclude that people will not voluntarily accept those offers, and that is just not happening at this point.
Yeah, and I wanted to get into some of these logistics with you, Steve, in terms of having these service treatment facilities available, even having the testing available for these different cases. There's some logistics issues here, I think.
Correct, and it's that intersection of the criminal justice system with due process requirements, with an issue of getting people healthy and off the street, and they're not incompatible, but it's a complex balance that we have to find. For example, if a crime is a gross misdemeanor with drug possession and it goes to a crime lab, our crime lab is backed up months in our state. They have other priorities, including things like homicide and sexual assault, which makes sense. But because of due process, there may be a timing issue, which again complicates this. So we have to find a way to address that constitutionally if there is a criminal sanction. And related to all these things, and I'll go back to Lisa's point because she's exactly right, the system needs to be there to make this work. And there's staffing shortages, and there's cost, and there's infrastructure, and all those things that make this heavy lifting. But it is absolutely critical if we're going to do this. Otherwise, the rest of this is sort of tangential to having availability to the resources that Lisa talks about.
Yeah, and I really think about a root issue here. And Steve, maybe I can start with you on this one. Just the rise in overdose deaths that we have seen around our country. Certainly here in our state, more than 2,000 overdose deaths in 2021, a 66% increase from 2019. And I know officers are encountering drug overdose deaths every day in these different cases. Do you think the work the legislature is doing here, fixing the Blake decision, will have an impact on that crisis?
It absolutely will. Absolutely it will. And it is this toxic mix of increase in availability to fentanyl, which is incredibly deadly, ease of access to a lot of other substances as well. The Blake decision, lack of resources. I mean, all these things are combining. The overdose deaths are up. I always think about bike officers that I've worked with in my career as a chief and a sheriff, who are out dealing with folks every day. And again, their goal was not to make arrests, to put people in jail. Their goal was to help people, to get them healthy and off the street. And it's heartbreaking. I mean, law enforcement wants the tools to do these things that we're talking about. And these changes in the Blake decision are really driven toward providing the tools, the infrastructure to get people healthy and off the street, and not just let them die in the street. That's not compassionate. Short answer to your question, these bills that Senator Robinson or Senator Solomon are working on, will they make a difference? I absolutely think they will.
Yeah, Lisa, your take on this, just this intersection between what we're dealing with a nationwide drug crisis and what the legislature is working on here with this Blake fix.
Right. I mean, Washington, going back to the beginning of 2021, I would say was at the absolute forefront of national sort of a shift in the national approach to these problems. And we unfortunately kind of tripped over our own feet because a court decision interfered with the timeline of consensus building. But we do know how to do this. This can be done. People do recover. Substance use, psychoactive substance use, trauma recovery, these are almost universal human experiences. This is not us and them. This is not people who are victimized and people. these are problems almost everyone encounters or a loved one encounters in the course of our lifetime. And we know what actually, what's the best we can do. We know what that is. We need to match public policy and investment to what we already have established works well and builds partnership. Yeah. We do not need to be on different sides of this. Everyone should be on the same side here. Yeah. And I think that this session, is just a test of, can we get back on the same side?
Yeah.
There is going to be a criminal sanction available.
Yeah.
The challenge to people who do the work that I do is, can we persuade law enforcement to use that rarely because there's something else? And to the legislature, can they give us the resources so that those alternatives are immediately available and very compelling, so that officers are not put to that last resort, except in very outlying cases.
And thank you, Lisa. You're going down the path that I need to with you here, because we're needing to wrap up. 30 more seconds, if you could. Any final words to the legislature? I know they're wrestling with a lot here. Some final thoughts for them to wrap up the show.
Build on what we already have, scale, lead, and arrest and jail alternatives, and don't mandate anyone to do the wrong thing under the circumstances.
Got it. Steve, need to wrap up here as the legislature works on this. Some final thoughts.
I'll just dovetail on what Lisa just said. A lot of acronyms, AJA, lead, mental health field response. The legislature entrusted us, the WASPIC, to help administer those programs, and we've been doing it for years. They've been growing each year. They're successful. They're success stories. This is a version of that very thing. Law enforcement and the other stakeholders have been working on this already. This will expand this. So in some ways, this is an opportunity. There's a model out there, and I do feel that the legislature will do good things. We have more work to do, but again, I think the senators I mentioned and others are doing good work, and I think we're going in a direction where we can do something productive.
All right, thank you both very much for this. Very much appreciated, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about our state's debate over drug possession laws? One person writes, SB 5536 and 5647 incentivize treatment, but give us tools to help keep public spaces from being open-air drug markets. Another person says, leftists claim crime rates are down. That's because we no longer arrest for drug possession. We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattle.gov. or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next time, doubling down on recycling in Washington. State lawmakers are considering the Washington Recycling and Packaging, or WRAP Act, which would impose a 10-cent bottle deposit like the one in Oregon, plus make producers of packaging materials responsible for the cost of recycling them. How will this work? We're taking a deep dive into the dumpster on the next City Inside Out. I hope you join us.